The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Greenwood Market as Anthony Johnson pushed his shopping cart down the cereal aisle. His 10-year-old son, Michael, walked beside him, carefully checking items off their shopping list with a stubby pencil. Anthony smiled at his son's serious expression. Ever since his wife had passed away 3 years ago, Michael had stepped up in ways that sometimes broke Anthony's heart. No child should have to grow up so fast. "Dad, can we get the cereal with the little marshmallows?" Michael asked, pointing to a colorful box on the top shelf. Anthony chuckled. "I thought we were sticking to the healthy stuff this week." Michael grinned, revealing the gap where his front tooth had fallen out last month. "It's Saturday tomorrow. We always have special breakfast on Saturdays." "You make a good point, buddy," Anthony said, reaching for the box. As a pediatric nurse, he knew all about balanced nutrition, but he also understood the importance of small joys. Working night shifts at Memorial Hospital while raising a son alone was challenging enough without becoming the fun police, too. As Anthony placed the cereal in their cart, he noticed an elderly woman struggling to reach something on a high shelf. "Michael, wait here with the cart. I'm going to help Mrs. Rivera over there." Michael nodded and Anthony walked over to the elderly woman. "Can I help you with something, ma'am?" Mrs. Rivera's weathered face lit up with recognition. "Oh, Anthony, you're such a dear. These old bones don't climb like they used to. Could you reach that can of beans for me?" Anthony easily retrieved the can and placed it in her basket. As they chatted briefly about Mrs. Rivera's grandchildren, Anthony felt eyes on him. Turning slightly, he caught sight of a blonde woman watching him from the end of the aisle. Her hand clutched her purse a little tighter, and she seemed to be observing his interaction with unusual intensity. Anthony was used to this. Despite his hospital scrubs and the stethoscope he sometimes forgot to remove after his shift, some people still saw only his skin color first. He turned his attention back to Mrs. Rivera, determined not to let the moment spoil his mood. "Dad, Dad." Michael came running up, holding a carton of ice cream. "Can we get this?"
"It's on sale!"
Anthony laughed at his son's enthusiasm. "Put it back, buddy. That'll melt before we finish shopping. But I can put it in the cold section right at the end," Michael pleaded with the negotiation skills of a seasoned lawyer. Before Anthony could respond, the blonde woman who had been watching approached them. Anthony instinctively placed a protective hand on Michael's shoulder. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice softer than Anthony expected. Up close, he noticed her tired eyes and the hospital ID badge clipped to her jacket that read, "Dr. Elizabeth Wilson." "Yes?" Anthony replied politely but cautiously. The woman seemed to hesitate. "I'm sorry for staring earlier. There have been some shoplifting incidents lately, and the store asked customers to be vigilant." She paused, looking embarrassed. "But then I noticed your hospital scrubs and, well, I jumped to conclusions. I apologize." Anthony studied her for a moment. He'd had enough encounters like this to know when someone was genuinely remorseful. "It's fine," he said simply. Michael, always quick to make friends, piped up. "My dad's a nurse. He takes care of sick kids." Elizabeth smiled at Michael. "That's a very important job." "He's the best," Michael stated with absolute conviction. "He even fixed Mrs. Rivera's grandson's arm when he fell out of a tree." "It was just a simple splint until the doctor came," Anthony explained modestly. Elizabeth's professional interest seemed piqued. "You work at Memorial?" "Yeah, pediatric ward, night shift mostly," Anthony replied. "Been there 8 years now. I just started in the ER there last month," Elizabeth said. "Transferred from Boston Children's after my divorce." She seemed surprised at herself for sharing this personal detail. An announcement over the store's speaker system reminded shoppers that the store would be closing in 15 minutes. "We should finish up," Anthony said to Michael. Then to Elizabeth, "Maybe I'll see you around the hospital." Elizabeth nodded. "I'm still learning my way around. It's a big change from Boston." "Dad, the ice cream," Michael reminded him, tugging at his sleeve. Anthony laughed. "Fine, go get it. But we're putting it in last." As Michael dashed off, Elizabeth commented, "He's a great kid. He's my whole world," Anthony replied, his voice filled with pride. Elizabeth hesitated again, then said, "My son Thomas is about his age. It's been tough on him, the move and everything." Anthony understood all too well the challenges of single parenthood. The Children's Center at the community college has some great weekend programs. Michael made friends there when we first moved here. "Thanks for the tip," Elizabeth said with genuine appreciation. And again, I'm sorry about earlier. Water under the bridge, Anthony assured her, though part of him wished people didn't carry such assumptions in the first place. Still, her apology seemed sincere, and working at the same hospital, they were likely to cross paths again. Michael returned with his ice cream and they headed to the checkout. Anthony couldn't help but notice Elizabeth in line behind them, buying just a few items: microwave dinners, cereal, and juice boxes, the typical provisions of a busy parent with little time to cook. As they loaded groceries into their car, Michael asked, "Is that lady a doctor at your hospital?" "Seems that way," Anthony replied, closing the trunk. "She looks sad," Michael observed with a child's simple perception. Anthony glanced back at the store where Elizabeth was now exiting with her single bag of groceries. "Sometimes grown-ups have a lot on their minds, buddy. Like you when you're doing bills?" Michael asked. Anthony laughed. "Exactly like that." On the drive home, Anthony thought about Elizabeth Wilson. He'd encountered plenty of prejudice in his life. Subtle glances, security guards following him in stores, patients requesting different nurses. Most times people didn't acknowledge their biases, let alone apologize for them. Elizabeth's admission was unexpected. Their modest two-bedroom house welcomed them with familiar comfort. After putting away groceries, Anthony helped Michael with his science homework, while chicken baked in the oven. These quiet evening routines were precious to Anthony, especially knowing he'd be working the night shift tomorrow. "Dad," Michael said as they finished dinner, "can I bring my basketball to Uncle Ray's tomorrow while you're at work?" "Sure thing. Just don't keep him up too late with your slam dunks," Anthony replied, thinking of his brother who helped with childcare during night shifts. Later, after tucking Michael into bed and reading him a chapter from his favorite adventure book, Anthony sat on the porch swing, enjoying the quiet neighborhood sounds. Fireflies blinked in the yard, and somewhere down the street a dog barked at a passing car. Anthony thought about his interaction with Elizabeth Wilson. Tomorrow he'd be back at Memorial for his 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift. The hospital was large enough that their paths might never cross again. But something told him this wasn't the last he'd see of the doctor from Boston. Little did he know that their next meeting would come much sooner than expected. Under circumstances neither of them could have anticipated. The pediatric ward at Memorial Hospital was unusually quiet for a Saturday night. Anthony adjusted the brightness on his computer screen as he updated patient charts, the soft glow illuminating his tired face. He'd been on shift for 4 hours, and so far it had been mostly routine, checking vitals, administering medications, and comforting a few anxious children. "Johnson, you want some coffee?" "I'm making a fresh pot," called Nurse Patel from the break room. "Thanks, but I'm trying to cut back," Anthony replied with a smile. "Keeps me up even after my shift ends." The truth was, Anthony had learned to function on minimal sleep since becoming a single parent. Between work, Michael's school activities, and household responsibilities, coffee had become more of a constant companion than a morning ritual. But lately he'd been trying to set a better example for his son, who'd started requesting coffee milk after seeing his father clutching a mug every morning. Anthony finished updating the charts and decided to check on 8-year-old Lily, who had been admitted with pneumonia earlier that day. As he approached her room, he heard the soft sound of her breathing, still labored but better than it had been hours ago. Her mother had finally fallen asleep in the recliner beside the bed, her hand still holding her daughter's. Anthony quietly checked Lily's vitals, careful not to wake either of them. "How's she doing?" whispered Dr. Chen, the attending physician, who had appeared in the doorway. "Fever's down to 100.2, and her oxygen saturation is holding at 94%, Anthony reported as they stepped into the hallway. "She's responding well to the antibiotics." Dr. Chen nodded with approval. "Good catch on recommending the different antibiotic. I might have stuck with the standard protocol." Anthony shrugged modestly. "I've seen similar cases where the traditional approach didn't work as quickly. Just a hunch." "Hunches based on experience save lives," Dr. Chen said, patting Anthony on the shoulder before continuing down the hall. After checking on his other patients, Anthony stopped at the nurse's station for a quick snack from his lunch bag. The hospital corridors were dim and peaceful at this hour, a stark contrast to the daytime chaos. He liked the night shift for this reason. It allowed him to spend afternoons with Michael after school, and the quieter atmosphere meant he could often Give more individualized attention to each child under his care. The relative calm was shattered at 11:42 p.m. by the sound of rapid footsteps and a woman's panicked voice. Anthony looked up to see a blur of blonde hair and a child being carried through the ward entrance. Help! Please, someone help my son. Anthony immediately recognized Elizabeth Wilson from the grocery store, now in street clothes instead of her professional attire. In her arms was a small boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, his face alarmingly pale as he struggled for breath. He can't breathe, Elizabeth gasped, her doctor's composure completely abandoned in her panic as a mother. The ER gave him an antihistamine shot for an allergic reaction, but he's getting worse. Anthony sprang into action, guiding them to an empty room. Let's get him on the bed, he instructed calmly. What's his name? Thomas, Elizabeth said, her voice shaking. He's 8. No known allergies until today. We had takeout and now his throat's closing up. The ER didn't think it was serious. Anthony could see the boy's chest heaving with the effort to breathe. He pressed the emergency call button while reaching for the oxygen mask. Thomas, I'm going to help you breathe better, okay? This is just oxygen. The boy's eyes were wide with fear, but he managed a tiny nod as Anthony placed the mask over his face. Dr. Reyes, the night pediatrician, rushed in seconds later. What do we have? As Anthony relayed the information, he noticed something about Thomas's symptoms that didn't quite align with a typical food allergy.
Has he had a fever or cough recently?
He asked Elizabeth. She nodded, running a hand through her disheveled hair. A slight cough for a few days. I thought it was just a cold. Any medications? Anthony asked while Dr. Reyes listened to Thomas's lungs. Just children's cold medicine. And his inhaler, he has mild asthma. Anthony exchanged a glance with Dr. Reyes. How long has he been on the cold medicine? 3 days, Elizabeth answered, her medical training seemingly coming back to her through the panic. It's a new brand. We ran out of our usual one. Anthony thought quickly, recalling a case from last year. Dr. Reyes, this could be a reaction to the guaifenesin in the cold medicine, complicated by his asthma. I saw a similar reaction in a patient with underlying respiratory issues. Dr. Reyes raised an eyebrow but didn't dismiss Anthony's suggestion. Let's get a blood panel and check his tryptase levels. And start him on epinephrine and corticosteroids. As Anthony efficiently carried out the orders, Elizabeth stood back, watching with a mother's terror and a doctor's assessment. I should have recognized it, she whispered more to herself than anyone else. I'm an ER doctor, for God's sake. It's different when it's your own child, Anthony said gently as he adjusted Thomas's IV. Every doctor I know falls apart when their kids get sick. Thomas's breathing eased slightly with the oxygen and initial medications, but his condition was still concerning. The blood work would take time, and Anthony could see that Elizabeth was barely holding herself together. Is there someone I can call for you? He asked her. Thomas's father or a friend? Elizabeth shook her head. His father's in Boston. I don't know anyone here yet. Her voice cracked. I'm all he has. Anthony recognized the fear and loneliness in her eyes. He'd felt it himself countless times when Michael had been sick. Well, right now Thomas has an entire medical team, he assured her. And we're not going anywhere. Over the next hour, Thomas's condition stabilized somewhat, though he still required close monitoring. The blood tests confirmed Anthony's suspicion. The combination of the specific decongestant in the new cold medicine had triggered a rare reaction, which was amplified by Thomas's asthma. You were right, Dr. Reyes told Anthony as they reviewed the results. Good call. Elizabeth overheard this and looked at Anthony with new understanding. When Dr. Reyes stepped out to consult with a colleague, she approached him. Thank you, she said simply. I was so scared. Just doing my job, Anthony replied, checking Thomas's IV line. No, Elizabeth insisted. Most nurses wouldn't have made that connection so quickly. Most doctors wouldn't have either. She paused, watching her son's chest rise and fall more evenly now. I misjudged you yesterday, and today you saved my son. Anthony met her gaze. You apologized yesterday. That's more than most people do. Still, Elizabeth said, I'm ashamed of my reaction at the store. Right now all that matters is Thomas, Anthony replied firmly, and he's going to be okay. As if on cue, Thomas opened his eyes and reached weakly for the oxygen mask. Mom, he mumbled. Elizabeth was instantly at his side, relief washing over her face. "I'm here, sweetheart. You're in the hospital, but you're going to be fine." "My throat hurts," Thomas complained, his voice raspy. "I know, buddy," Anthony said, adjusting the bed to a more comfortable position. "That's from the breathing tube we had to use earlier. It'll feel better soon." Thomas looked at Anthony with curiosity. "Are you my doctor?" "I'm your nurse," Anthony explained with a smile. "Nurses do all the cool stuff." This brought a small smile to Thomas's pale face before his eyelids grew heavy again. "He needs rest," Anthony told Elizabeth. "The medications make him drowsy, but that's good right now. His body needs to recover." Elizabeth nodded, sinking into the chair beside Thomas's bed. For the first time, Anthony noticed how exhausted she looked, not just from tonight's crisis, but from something deeper. The weight of being a single parent in a new city with no support system was something he understood all too well. "Have you eaten anything?" Anthony asked. When Elizabeth shook her head, he added, "The cafeteria's closed, but we have some decent sandwiches in the break room. I can bring you one." "You don't have to do that," Elizabeth protested weakly. "I know, but I'm going to anyway." When Anthony returned with a sandwich and a cup of tea, he found Elizabeth staring at her phone, scrolling through what looked like apartment listings. "House hunting?" he asked, setting the food on the small table beside her. Elizabeth sighed, putting the phone down. "Our temporary housing expires next month. I thought I'd have more time to look for a good school district. But between the new job and getting Thomas settled," she trailed off, taking a bite of the sandwich instead of finishing her thought. Anthony sat in the chair across from her. "The Westridge area has great schools. It's where Michael and I live." "Michael's your son? From the grocery store?" Anthony nodded. "He's 10. He'd probably get along well with Thomas." He hesitated, then added, "When Thomas is feeling better, maybe the boys could meet. Michael's always looking for new friends to shoot hoops with." A genuine smile broke through Elizabeth's worry. "Thomas loves basketball. He's been complaining that he doesn't know anyone to play with here." Their conversation was interrupted by a notification on Anthony's tablet. Another patient needed attention. "Duty calls," he said, standing up. "Try to get some rest while Thomas is sleeping. That chair reclines all the way back, and there are blankets in the cabinet." As Anthony turned to leave, Elizabeth caught his arm. "Thank you, Anthony. Not just for Thomas, but for—" She gestured vaguely. "I'm being kind, when I didn't deserve it." Anthony looked down at her hand on his arm, then met her eyes. "Everyone deserves kindness, especially when they're scared for their child." He paused, then added more lightly, "Besides, now you owe me one. Maybe you can return the favor by showing me where they hide the good coffee in the ER." This drew a small laugh from Elizabeth, the first sign of relief in her tense face. "Deal." As Anthony continued his rounds, checking on other patients and documenting their status, his thoughts kept returning to Elizabeth and Thomas. Their situation mirrored his own in many ways. Single parent, new beginnings, the constant juggling act between work and family. He knew firsthand how isolating that could be. By 3 a.m., Thomas's condition had improved significantly. The medication was working, and his breathing was almost back to normal. Elizabeth had finally dozed off in the recliner, her hand still reaching toward her son's bed. Anthony quietly entered to check Thomas's vitals one more time. The boy stirred slightly but didn't wake. Looking at his peaceful face, now pink with healthy color returning, Anthony felt the familiar satisfaction that had drawn him to nursing in the first place, the knowledge that he had helped make a difference when it mattered most. As he updated Thomas's chart, Anthony glanced at Elizabeth's sleeping form. Life had a funny way of bringing people together, he thought. Yesterday they had been strangers with assumptions and barriers between them. Tonight those barriers had crumbled in the face of something far more important. Little did Anthony know that Thomas's emergency was only the beginning of their story, and that the real crisis was yet to come. Dawn was breaking when Anthony's shift was supposed to end, but he hadn't left Thomas's room for the past hour. Something wasn't right. Despite the treatment, Thomas's oxygen levels had started dropping again around 5 a.m. Dr. Reyes had ordered additional tests and adjusted his medication, but the boy's condition continued to worsen. "I don't understand," Elizabeth said, her earlier composure completely shattered as she watched monitors beeping with warning signals. He was getting better. Anthony studied Thomas's chart with growing concern. The boy's lips had taken on a bluish tint, and his breathing was becoming more labored by the minute. Dr. Reyes, his tryptase levels are still elevated, and his blood pressure is dropping, Anthony reported as the doctor re-entered the room. Dr. Reyes frowned, examining Thomas's rash, which had spread from his chest to his neck. This isn't just an allergic reaction anymore. Call Dr. Patel from immunology. He's not on call today, Anthony said quietly.
And Dr. Wilson is at a conference in Chicago until tomorrow. Elizabeth's medical training kicked in through her panic.
What about dress syndrome? Could the cold medicine have triggered it? Dr. Reyes considered this. Possible, but that usually develops over days or weeks, not hours. Anthony's mind raced through similar cases he'd witnessed over his years in pediatrics. What if it's not just the cold medicine? He suggested. Thomas has asthma. What other medications is he on? Elizabeth looked up sharply. Just his regular inhaler, and her face suddenly paled. Oh God, I switched his inhaler brand last week. The insurance wouldn't cover his usual one. Anthony and Dr. Reyes exchanged glances. We need to consider a potential cross-reaction between the inhaler propellant and the cold medicine, Anthony said. I saw a case like this 3 years ago. Different medications, but similar presentation. I've never seen such a reaction documented in literature, Dr. Reyes said skeptically. It was Dr. Lambert's case, Anthony persisted. A 9-year-old girl. He published a case study in the Journal of Pediatric Allergy and Immunology. Dr. Reyes hesitated, clearly trying to recall the article. My son is dying, Elizabeth cried, her professional demeanor crumbling completely. Please do something. The monitors beeped more urgently as Thomas's oxygen saturation dipped below 85%. We need to intubate, Dr. Reyes decided, and start him on broad-spectrum immunosuppressants while we figure this out. As they prepared for the procedure, Anthony caught Elizabeth's arm and guided her gently from the bedside. You don't want to watch this, he said softly. Let us take care of him. Elizabeth resisted. I'm a doctor. I've done hundreds of intubations. But not on your own child, Anthony reminded her. Please, Elizabeth. Trust us. Something in Anthony's steady gaze seemed to reach her. She nodded shakily and allowed him to lead her into the hallway, where she immediately collapsed into a chair, burying her face in her hands. Anthony returned to help with the intubation, which was successful, but Thomas's condition remained precarious. His body was fighting something their standard protocols weren't addressing. Dr. Reyes, I really think we should look at that case study, Anthony urged as they adjusted the ventilator settings. The treatment approach was unconventional but effective. Dr. Reyes looked exhausted and uncertain. Our pediatric immunologist is unavailable, Anthony. I can't authorize experimental treatment without consultation. Then let me find the case study, Anthony insisted. It's in our hospital's medical library database. Dr. Reyes glanced at Thomas's monitors, then at his watch. Finally, he nodded. Do it quickly. We don't have much time. Anthony hurried to the nurse's station computer. His shift had technically ended 15 minutes ago, and Nurse Rodriguez had already arrived to take over. But there was no way he was leaving now. He quickly searched the hospital's medical database for Dr. Lambert's article, finding it buried in a special issue from 3 years prior. The case was remarkably similar. A child with asthma experiencing a severe reaction after using a new inhaler alongside a common cold medication. Dr. Lambert had successfully treated it with a specific combination of medications that counteracted both the allergic response and the inflammatory cascade it had triggered. Anthony printed the article and rushed back to Thomas's room, where Dr. Reyes was consulting with Dr. Lin, an internal medicine specialist who had been called in to assist. Here, Anthony said, presenting the case study. The treatment protocol is on page 4. The doctors reviewed the article together, their expressions grave. This is highly unorthodox, Dr. Lin said with a frown. But it worked, Anthony pointed out, and the patient's presentation was nearly identical. The risks are significant, Dr. Reyes cautioned. We'd be using these drugs in an off-label combination. And if we don't? Anthony asked quietly. The doctors exchanged glances, their silence answering his question more clearly than words could have. We need to discuss this with the mother, Dr. Lin decided. She needs to understand the risks. They found Elizabeth in the hallway pacing like a caged animal. When Dr. Reyes explained the situation and the proposed treatment, her eyes darted to Anthony. who stood slightly behind the physicians. "This case study," she said, her voice hoarse from crying. "You're sure it's similar?" "Yes," Anthony answered, stepping forward despite protocol. "I remember the case clearly. I assisted Dr. Lambert throughout the treatment." Elizabeth looked from Anthony to the doctors, then through the window at her son, small and vulnerable amid a tangle of tubes and wires. "What are his chances without this treatment?" Dr. Lin cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Given the rapid progression and his current state, not good, and with it, better," Dr. Reyes said cautiously. "But there are significant risks, organ damage particularly to the kidneys and liver." Elizabeth closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them, they held a mother's fierce determination. "Do it. Try the treatment." The doctors nodded and returned to Thomas's room to prepare the medication. Elizabeth remained in the hallway, hugging herself as if trying to physically hold herself together. Anthony stayed with her, standing silently by her side. After a moment, he said, "I should call my brother. My shift ended a while ago and he'll be worried." "Your son?" Elizabeth remembered suddenly. "Michael. He'll be waiting for you." "He's with my brother," Anthony assured her. "They know hospital schedules can be unpredictable." Elizabeth looked at him with raw emotion. "You should go home to your son. You've done more than enough." Anthony shook his head. "I'd like to stay if that's okay. See this through." Their eyes met, and in that moment, a wordless understanding passed between them. The kind that exists only between parents who know what it means to be someone's entire world. "Thank you," Elizabeth whispered. The next hours were a blur of activity as the medical team administered the experimental treatment and monitored Thomas closely for any adverse reactions. Anthony moved between helping the on-duty nurses and sitting with Elizabeth, who alternated between professional analysis of her son's vital signs and moments of profound maternal vulnerability. By noon, Thomas's condition had stabilized, though he remained critical. Dr. Reyes, who should have gone off duty hours ago, was still there, reviewing test results with the day shift team. "The treatment seems to be working," he told Elizabeth cautiously. "His inflammatory markers are decreasing and his oxygen saturation is improving." "When can you remove the breathing tube?" Elizabeth asked, her doctor's mind focusing on the next steps. "Not for at least 24 hours, Dr. Reyes explained. We need to be sure his airway swelling has completely resolved." Elizabeth nodded, her exhaustion evident in every line of her face. "You should get some rest," Anthony suggested gently. "There's a family room down the hall with a couch. I can wake you if there's any change." Elizabeth shook her head stubbornly. "I'm not leaving him." "Elizabeth," Anthony said, using her first name deliberately to break through her doctor's facade. "You can't help Thomas if you collapse. A few hours of sleep will help you think clearly." She wavered, glancing at her son's still form. "What if he wakes up scared and I'm not here?" "He's heavily sedated," Anthony reminded her. "He won't wake up until we reduce the medication. And I promise I'll stay with him." "Your shift ended hours ago," Elizabeth protested weakly. "I'm off for the next 2 days," Anthony said with a small smile. "I have nowhere else to be." This wasn't entirely true. He had promised to help Michael with his science project, and they had tickets for a movie that evening. But his brother would understand the need to reschedule. Some things were more important. Finally, Elizabeth agreed to lie down in the family room, though she made Anthony promise to wake her in 2 hours or if there was any change in Thomas's condition. Once she had gone, Anthony pulled a chair up to Thomas's bedside and sat down heavily. The adrenaline that had kept him going was wearing off and fatigue was setting in. He checked Thomas's vital signs one more time, then pulled out his phone to call his brother. "Hey, Ray," he said quietly when his brother answered. "I'm still at the hospital. There's a situation with a patient. Everything okay?" Ray asked, concern evident in his voice. "It will be," Anthony replied, hoping it was true. "But I need to stay a while longer." "Is Michael doing all right?" "He's fine," Ray assured him. "We're making pancakes shaped like dinosaurs." "Very scientific." Anthony smiled despite his exhaustion. "Tell him I'm sorry about the science project and the movie." "We'll reschedule." "He'll understand," Ray said. "You want me to keep him overnight if needed?" "I'm hoping to be home by evening, but yes, be prepared just in case." "Thanks, Ray." After hanging up, Anthony leaned back in his chair and watched the steady rise and fall of Thomas's chest, aided by the ventilator. The boy's color was better, and his rash was beginning to fade, promising signs that the treatment was working. As a nurse, Anthony had seen countless children fight through serious illnesses. But there was something about this case that felt different. Perhaps it was the parallel to his own life. Another single parent struggling to balance work and family in a world that didn't make it easy. Or perhaps it was the way Elizabeth had looked at him in that moment of crisis, with complete trust despite their brief and initially awkward acquaintance. Anthony must have dozed off, because he woke with a start when a hand touched his shoulder. Elizabeth stood there, looking marginally better after her rest. "You were supposed to wake me after 2 hours." She chided gently. Anthony checked his watch and was surprised to see that nearly 3 hours had passed. "Sorry, I guess I needed the rest too." Elizabeth's eyes moved to her son, immediately assessing his condition. "His color is better," she noted with cautious hope. "His latest blood work shows significant improvement," Anthony confirmed. "The treatment is working, Elizabeth." She sank into the chair beside him, relief washing over her face. "I can't believe I almost lost him." "But you didn't," Anthony reminded her. "He's going to be okay." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both watching Thomas breathe. Finally, Elizabeth spoke again, her voice soft but steady. "When I first saw you in the grocery store, I made assumptions based on nothing but your appearance. And then, just hours later, I was begging you to save my son." She shook her head, seemingly at herself. Life has a way of teaching humility. Anthony considered her words carefully before responding. "We all make judgments based on our experiences and what we've been taught to see. The question is whether we're willing to look deeper when given the chance." "You're being very generous," Elizabeth said, meeting his eyes. "Maybe," Anthony acknowledged. "Or maybe I just understand that people are complicated and first impressions rarely tell the whole story." A nurse entered to check Thomas's vitals, interrupting their conversation. The day shift was in full swing now, and the pediatric ward was busy with medical staff, visiting parents, and the occasional sound of a child's laughter from the playroom down the hall. Dr. Patel, who had been called in despite not being on duty, arrived to examine Thomas. After reviewing his chart and the treatment that had been administered, he looked at Anthony with newfound respect. "Good catch remembering that case study, Johnson," he said. Not many would have made that connection. Anthony nodded in acknowledgement of the compliment, though he felt it was unnecessary. He hadn't done anything special, just drawn on his experience and fought for a patient who needed an advocate. As Dr. Patel discussed next steps with Elizabeth, Anthony's phone buzzed with a text from his brother. "Michael wants to know if he can come visit you at the hospital. Says he has a picture he drew for your patient." Anthony smiled at his son's thoughtfulness. Michael knew his father sometimes grew attached to the children he cared for, especially those in serious condition. It wasn't the first time he had drawn pictures for Anthony's patients. "Everything okay?" Elizabeth asked as Dr. Patel left the room. "Yes," Anthony replied. "That was my brother. Michael drew a picture for Thomas and wants to bring it by." Elizabeth looked surprised, then touched. "That's very sweet of him. I'd love to meet him, if that's all right." Anthony hesitated, suddenly aware of how intertwined their lives had become in just 24 hours. "Are you sure? You've been through a lot, and visitors might be overwhelming." "Anthony," Elizabeth said with a small smile, "your son drew a picture for my son. I think that deserves a proper thank you." So Anthony texted his brother back, inviting them to stop by the hospital around 4 p.m., when Thomas was scheduled for his next assessment. If all went well, the doctors might even begin reducing his sedation. As he sent the text, Anthony realized that his ordinary weekend had taken an extraordinary turn. What had begun as a routine night shift had become something much more significant, perhaps even the beginning of an unexpected friendship. What he didn't yet realize was that the real challenge was still to come, and that both families would be tested in ways none of them could have anticipated. The afternoon sun streamed through the hospital windows, casting warm rectangles of light across Thomas's room. The boy was still intubated but making remarkable progress. His latest blood work showed significant improvement, and Dr. Patel had begun gradually reducing his sedation. If all continued well, they would attempt to remove the breathing tube the following morning. Elizabeth had finally stepped out to shower in the hospital staff locker room after Anthony convinced her that he wouldn't leave Thomas's side. She returned looking somewhat refreshed, her damp hair pulled back and wearing scrubs borrowed from the attending physician's lounge. Any change? She asked immediately upon entering the room. All good news, Anthony assured her. His oxygen levels are holding steady, and he moved his fingers a few minutes ago, first voluntary movement since the sedation was decreased. Relief washed over Elizabeth's face as she took her place in the chair beside her son's bed. The attending says they're amazed at his recovery rate. That protocol you found? She paused, meeting Anthony's eyes directly. You saved his life. Anthony shifted uncomfortably under her gratitude. It was a team effort. No, Elizabeth insisted. The team followed protocol. You went beyond it. She reached out impulsively and squeezed his hand. I'll never forget that. Their moment was interrupted by a tentative knock at the door. Anthony looked up to see his brother Ray standing there with Michael, who clutched a large piece of construction paper in his hands. Is this a bad time? Ray asked, glancing at Thomas in the hospital bed. Not at all, Anthony said, standing to greet them. Come in. Michael approached cautiously, his eyes wide at the sight of all the medical equipment. At 10 years old, he was familiar with hospitals from visiting his father at work. But the intensive care setting was still intimidating. Michael, this is Dr. Wilson and her son Thomas, Anthony introduced them. Thomas is sleeping right now because of his medicine, but he's getting better. Michael nodded solemnly, then held out his drawing to Elizabeth. I made this for Thomas. Dad said he was really sick. Elizabeth accepted the artwork with genuine appreciation. It depicted two boys playing basketball against a backdrop of what appeared to be a hospital, transforming into a playground, a colorful visual metaphor for recovery and healing. This is beautiful, Elizabeth said, her voice catching slightly. Thomas loves basketball. He'll be so happy to see this when he wakes up. Michael beamed at the praise. Dad says you just moved here. We can show Thomas all the good basketball courts when he's better. Elizabeth smiled at the boy's straightforward kindness. That sounds wonderful. I think Thomas would like that very much. Ray, who had been watching this exchange with interest, extended his hand to Elizabeth. I'm Ray, Anthony's brother and occasional child care provider. Nice to meet you, Dr. Wilson. Please call me Elizabeth, she replied, shaking his hand. And thank you for bringing Michael. It means a lot. As the adults chatted quietly, Michael moved closer to Thomas's bed, studying the sleeping boy with curiosity rather than fear. Will he remember being sick? He asked no one in particular. Anthony placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Probably not much. The medicine helps him rest so his body can heal. Michael considered this. When I had my tonsils out, I only remember the ice cream after. This drew a small laugh from Elizabeth. That's usually how it works. The not fun parts fade from memory. The conversation flowed surprisingly easily among them. Ray, a high school history teacher, shared amusing stories about his students' creative excuses for missing homework. Elizabeth talked about Boston and their reasons for moving to a smaller city. Michael proudly described his science project, a model of the solar system that would actually rotate. Throughout it all, Anthony observed the natural way his son and brother interacted with Elizabeth. There was an easy comfort in their conversation, as if they'd known each other for years rather than hours. It warmed something in him that had been cold for a long time. The peaceful atmosphere was broken when Thomas's monitors suddenly began beeping with increased urgency. The boy's oxygen levels were dropping again. What's happening? Elizabeth asked, immediately at her son's side, her momentary relaxation replaced by renewed fear. Anthony quickly assessed the situation, checking the ventilator connections and Thomas's vital signs. His airway might be swelling again, he said, pressing the call button for the medical team. Ray, take Michael outside, please. As Ray ushered a wide-eyed Michael from the room, Dr. Patel and two nurses rushed in. What followed was a tense 15 minutes of medical intervention. Thomas's body was fighting the breathing tube, a potentially positive sign that he was regain. Very excited to meet you. At Elizabeth's nod, Anthony stepped into the hallway and waved to Ray and Michael, who had been waiting impatiently nearby. Michael approached the bed with unusual caution for an energetic 10-year-old. Hi, Thomas. I'm Michael. I was reading you a story, but you were asleep. Thomas regarded this new visitor with curiosity. What story? Michael held up his book. Treasure Island. It's about pirates. Do you like pirates? A small smile appeared on Thomas's pale face. Pirates are cool. And just like that, a connection was formed between two boys who, despite their different backgrounds and circumstances, found common ground in the universal language of childhood. As the boys chatted, Michael doing most of the talking while Thomas listened with increasing interest, Anthony and Elizabeth stepped back, watching this natural friendship begin to unfold. "Thank you," Elizabeth said quietly, her eyes still on her son. "For everything." Anthony followed her gaze, taking in the remarkable scene. Thomas, who had been fighting for his life just hours ago, now engaged in an animated discussion about which superhero could beat which in a fair fight. Michael, whose boundless energy was somehow perfectly calibrated to his new friend's weakened state. "This is what healing looks like," Anthony observed. "Not just the medicine, but this human connection." Elizabeth nodded. And when she finally turned to look at him, there was something new in her eyes, not just gratitude, but a deeper understanding. "I think we both needed that," she said simply. And in that moment, Anthony realized that something significant had shifted between them. What had begun as a tense encounter in a grocery store had evolved through crisis into something neither of them had expected. The beginning of a connection that transcended their differences and found its foundation in their shared humanity. What neither of them knew was that their journey together was far from over. Thomas's recovery was just the first chapter in a story that would continue to unfold in ways they couldn't imagine, testing their newfound friendship and revealing depths in both of them that had long remained hidden. 3 months had passed since Thomas's life-threatening emergency. The summer heat had given way to crisp autumn air, and leaves in vibrant shades of red and gold drifted down from the trees lining Westridge Park. Thomas, now fully recovered, dribbled a basketball with growing confidence across the community court. His thin frame had filled out somewhat, and color had returned to his once pale cheeks. Nearby, Michael called out encouragement, clapping enthusiastically when Thomas successfully made a basket. From a bench at the edge of the court, Anthony and Elizabeth watched their sons with matching expressions of contentment. Their lives had become intertwined in ways neither could have predicted that day in the grocery store. "Thomas has improved so much at basketball," Anthony commented, handing Elizabeth a cup of coffee from the thermos he'd brought. "Michael's a good coach." Elizabeth smiled, accepting the cup gratefully. The autumn chill required layers now, sweaters and light jackets that rustled with each movement. "Michael's good at a lot of things. His science presentation last week was amazing." It had become their routine, this easy exchange of observations about each other's children, the comfortable silence of people who no longer felt the need to fill every moment with conversation. After Thomas's release from the hospital, Elizabeth had found an apartment just 10 minutes from Anthony and Michael. What had begun as practical support during Thomas's recovery had evolved into a friendship that benefited all of them. "How are things at the hospital?" Anthony asked, watching as Michael demonstrated a proper layup technique to Thomas. "Dr. Chen mentioned you took on some additional ER shifts." Elizabeth nodded, cradling her coffee cup for warmth. "The extra money helps, especially with Thomas's medical bills. Even with insurance, the copays are substantial." Anthony understood the financial strain all too well. Single parenting came with a unique set of challenges, not least of which was the constant juggling of work and family responsibilities. "Michael's been asking about our camping trip," he said, changing the subject to something more pleasant. "I think he's written a packing list that includes everything except the kitchen sink." Elizabeth laughed, the sound carrying across the park. "Thomas is the same. You'd think we were going on a month-long expedition instead of a weekend at Lake Westwood." The camping trip had been Michael's idea, a celebration of Thomas's complete recovery and the 3-month anniversary of their friendship. Anthony had been surprised when Elizabeth agreed readily. She seemed more like the hotel type than someone who enjoyed sleeping in a tent, but her enthusiasm matched the boys. "Dad, did you see that?" Michael called out, interrupting Anthony's thoughts. "Thomas made 3 baskets in a row. Great job, Thomas." Anthony called back with genuine pride. He had come to care for the boy almost as much as his own son. Elizabeth leaned slightly against Anthony's shoulder, a gesture of shared pride that felt natural between them now. "I never thought he'd recover so completely," she admitted quietly. "There were moments in that hospital room when I was certain I was going to lose him." Anthony covered her hand with his own briefly. "But you didn't. He's thriving." She turned to look at him directly, her blue eyes serious. "Because of you, Anthony. I've never properly thanked you for what you did." You've thanked me plenty, he assured her, feeling slightly uncomfortable with her intensity. Besides, it's what any nurse would have done. No, Elizabeth insisted. It's not. You went above and beyond your professional duties. You stayed well past your shift. You brought your son to visit a stranger. She paused, emotion catching in her throat. You saw us as people who needed help, not as... She didn't finish the thought, but Anthony understood. Not as a white woman who had judged him in a grocery store. Not as different from him in any way that mattered. We're both parents, he said simply. That's what connected us from the beginning, even if we didn't realize it right away. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of several other families at the park. The neighborhood association had organized a fall festival, complete with pumpkin decorating, apple cider, and various games for the children. As community events coordinator, Anthony had helped plan the festivities. Mr. Johnson called Mrs. Patel, waving from near the refreshment table. We're ready to set up the three-legged race whenever you are. Anthony stood, brushing leaves from his jeans. Duty calls. Are you going to join the parent-child sack race later? Elizabeth grimaced playfully. Absolutely not. Thomas and I will cheer from the sidelines, thank you very much. The festival soon transformed the quiet park into a bustling community gathering. Children darted between activity stations while parents chatted in small groups, catching up on neighborhood news and comparing notes on the local schools. Anthony moved through it all with easy confidence, his natural leadership evident in the way people sought out his opinion and assistance. Elizabeth watched from a distance as he helped set up games, resolved a minor dispute between two kids over the last caramel apple, and still managed to keep an eye on Michael and Thomas, who were now enthusiastically decorating pumpkins at a craft table. He's quite something, isn't he? Said a voice beside her. Elizabeth turned to find Ray, Anthony's brother, offering her a cup of hot apple cider. He is, she agreed, accepting the drink. The whole neighborhood seems to adore him. Ray chuckled. Anthony's always been like that, the guy everyone depends on. Even when we were kids. He paused, his expression growing more serious. That's why his wife's death hit him so hard. For once, there was something he couldn't fix. Elizabeth hadn't heard much about Anthony's late wife. He rarely spoke of her, though photographs in his home testified to a happy marriage cut tragically short. How long has it been? She asked softly. 3 years in December, Ray replied. Cancer. Michael was only 7. He glanced at Elizabeth appraisingly. He hasn't brought anyone to these neighborhood events since then. You're the first. Before Elizabeth could respond to this loaded observation, they were interrupted by the boys running up, their hands stained with paint from pumpkin decorating. Mom! Look at my pumpkin, Thomas exclaimed, holding up a small gourd covered in an elaborate pattern of stars and moons. Michael helped with the design. Very impressive, Elizabeth praised, examining the artwork. You two make a good team. We're the best team, Michael declared confidently. That's why we're going to win the three-legged race. But we need to practice first, Thomas added. Can we go try? After the mothers gave permission, the boys dashed off again, their energy seemingly inexhaustible. They've become inseparable, Ray observed. It's good for Michael. He needed a close friend. Elizabeth nodded in agreement. Thomas, too. Moving here was hard on him, especially right after the divorce. The afternoon progressed pleasantly, with various competitions bringing laughter and good-natured rivalry among neighbors. As predicted, Michael and Thomas won the children's three-legged race, their hours of practice paying off with a coordinated effort that left other teams hopelessly tangled. The highlight of the festival came toward evening, when Mrs. Rivera, the elderly woman Anthony had helped at the grocery store months earlier, took the makeshift stage set up near the refreshment tables. As president of the neighborhood association, and she had an announcement to make. Before we wrap up our wonderful fall festival, I'd like to take a moment to recognize someone special in our community, she began, her voice wavering slightly with age but clear with purpose. Many of you know Anthony Johnson as our dedicated community events coordinator, basketball coach for the junior league, and the person we all call when something needs fixing. A ripple of appreciative laughter moved through the crowd. Anthony stood to the side, looking slightly uncomfortable with the attention. But some of you may not know that Anthony is also a pediatric nurse at Memorial Hospital, where he has saved countless lives with his skill and compassion. Mrs. Rivera continued, one of those lives belongs to a new member of our community, young Thomas Wilson. All eyes turned to Thomas, who blushed but stood a little straighter beside his mother. 3 months ago, Thomas experienced a life-threatening medical emergency. It was Anthony who recognized the unusual nature of his condition and advocated for a treatment that ultimately saved his life. Mrs. Rivera gestured for Elizabeth to join her. Dr. Wilson has asked for a moment to express her gratitude publicly. Elizabeth hadn't planned to speak in front of the entire neighborhood, but seeing Anthony's surprised expression, she found the courage to step forward. Thomas gave her an encouraging thumbs up as she made her way to the small stage. "Hello, everyone," she began somewhat nervously. Public speaking had never been her forte. "Most of you don't know me yet. My son Thomas and I moved here from Boston just a few months ago. We didn't know anyone, and I was struggling to balance a new job with single parenthood in an unfamiliar city." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "My first interaction with Anthony Johnson wasn't my proudest moment. I saw him in a grocery store and made judgments based on appearance alone. Just hours later, I found myself in the emergency room with my son, who was fighting to breathe." The crowd had grown completely silent. Captivated by her story, by some miracle, Anthony was the nurse on duty in the pediatric ward that night. He not only provided exceptional medical care, but stayed long past his shift to make sure Thomas was stable. When traditional treatments weren't working, he remembered an obscure case study that ultimately provided the solution that saved my son's life. Elizabeth's voice grew thick with emotion, but she pressed on. "What Anthony did goes far beyond professional duty. He opened his home and his heart to 2 strangers in need. His son Michael became Thomas's first friend here, visiting him in the hospital and reading to him when he was still unconscious." She looked directly at Anthony now, no longer addressing the crowd. "You showed me what true compassion looks like without judgment or expectation. You remind me every day that our differences matter far less than what we share. Love for our children, dedication to our community, and the simple human capacity to care for one another." The gathering erupted in applause as Elizabeth stepped down from the stage. Anthony stood motionless for a moment, clearly moved by her words. Then, in a gesture that seemed to surprise even him, he stepped forward and embraced her. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair. The public acknowledgement shifted something between them, bringing into the open what had been quietly growing over the past 3 months. As the festival wound down and families began to disperse, Anthony and Elizabeth found themselves working side by side to clean up, their movements in sync like partners in a familiar dance. The boys helped too, though their assistance consisted mainly of chasing down stray napkins that had escaped into the wind and testing the leftover cookies to make sure they were still good. "Did you mean what you said up there?" Anthony asked quietly as they folded up the last of the tablecloths. "About our differences not mattering?" Elizabeth paused, looking at him thoughtfully. "I meant every word. That day in the grocery store, I was carrying so many assumptions, so much unconscious bias. I'm ashamed of it now." "We all have biases," Anthony said. "The question is whether we're willing to recognize them and move beyond them." "You were more generous with me than I deserved," Elizabeth admitted. Anthony shook his head. "What I saw was a mother who loved her child fiercely. Everything else was secondary." As they finished packing up the festival supplies, Ray approached with the boys in tow. "I'm heading home," he announced. "Michael, you coming with me or your dad?" Before Michael could answer, Thomas spoke up. "Can Michael come over to our place? Mom made her famous spaghetti and we want to finish planning our camping trip." The adults exchanged glances. This hadn't been discussed beforehand, but it wasn't an unusual request. The boys often spent time at each other's homes. "It's fine with me if it's okay with Anthony," Elizabeth said. "Sure," Anthony agreed. "I'll pick him up later." But Ray had another suggestion. "Why don't you all have dinner together? I need to grade papers tonight anyway." He gave his brother a meaningful look that didn't go unnoticed by Elizabeth. And so, as the sun set over Westridge Park, the 4 of them walked together toward Elizabeth's apartment, the boys running ahead with boundless energy, while the adults followed at a more measured pace. "Your brother isn't subtle," Elizabeth commented with amusement. Anthony laughed. "Ray's never been one to beat around the bush." "Sorry about that." "Don't be," she replied, her voice softening. "I like his idea." They walked in comfortable silence for a moment, their breath visible in the cooling evening air. So, about this camping trip, Anthony said eventually. Are you really up for sleeping on the ground in 40-degree weather? Elizabeth grinned. Absolutely not. But I'm willing to endure it for Thomas. He's never been camping before. We'll bring plenty of extra blankets, Anthony promised, and I make a mean campfire hot chocolate. Is that so? She teased. Any other hidden talents I should know about? Their easy banter continued as they reached the apartment, where the boys were already waiting impatiently at the door. The small two-bedroom unit had become cozier in recent weeks, with Thomas's artwork covering the refrigerator and several potted plants from Anthony's garden, brightening the windowsills. Dinner was a lively affair, with the boys dominating the conversation, their camping plans growing more elaborate by the minute. Thomas had apparently decided they needed to bring equipment for catching and studying frogs, while Michael insisted that a proper astronomy session was essential, and we need extra flashlights for the ghost stories, Michael added with enthusiasm. Not too scary, Elizabeth cautioned. I don't want any nightmares. Mom, Thomas groaned with the exasperation only a child can muster. We're not babies. Ghost stories are a camping tradition, Anthony told Elizabeth with a smile, but I promise to keep them age-appropriate. After dinner, the boys disappeared into Thomas's room to continue their planning, leaving the adults to clean up the kitchen together. They're so excited about this trip, Elizabeth observed as she rinsed dishes and handed them to Anthony for the dishwasher. It's all Thomas talks about. Same with Michael, Anthony replied. I think what they're really excited about is the four of us doing something together as a... He trailed off, suddenly aware of the implication. As a family? Elizabeth finished for him, her voice careful but not dismissive. Anthony nodded, watching her face for signs of discomfort. Is that too weird to say out loud? Elizabeth set down the plate she was rinsing and turned to face him fully. Anthony, you and Michael have become incredibly important to us. I think we crossed the line from neighbors helping each other out to something more meaningful a while ago. And what is that something? Anthony asked, taking a step closer. Elizabeth took a deep breath. I don't know exactly, but I'd like to find out if you would. The moment stretched between them, filled with possibility. Then from Thomas's room came the sound of laughter, pure, uninhibited joy that bridged all differences and reminded them of what truly mattered. Anthony smiled, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind Elizabeth's ear. I think our sons are way ahead of us on this one. None better like this, and I happen to know there's someone who's... They usually are, she agreed with a laugh. Later that evening, as Anthony and Michael walked home under a canopy of stars, the boy looked up at his father with uncharacteristic seriousness. Dad, are you and Dr. Wilson, Elizabeth, going to be together? Anthony considered how to answer this surprisingly direct question. Would that be okay with you if we were? Michael thought for a moment, then nodded decisively. Yeah, Thomas thinks so too. We talked about it. Oh, you did you? Anthony asked, amused by the boy's matchmaking efforts. Thomas said his mom smiles more since we met her. And you laugh more too, Dad. Out of the mouths of babes, Anthony thought. Leave it to children to cut straight to what matters. Well, we're all going camping together next weekend. Let's start there and see what happens, okay? Michael seemed satisfied with this answer. Okay, but Dad, I think it's going to be awesome. As they reached their house, Anthony looked back in the direction they had come, where he knew Elizabeth and Thomas would be getting ready for bed in their apartment. He thought about the journey that had brought them together, from a moment of prejudice in a grocery store to a mother begging him to save her child, and finally to this, the beginning of something new and full of promise. Yeah, buddy, he agreed, putting his arm around his son's shoulders. I think it's going to be awesome too. 3 months ago, they had been strangers divided by assumptions. Today, they were 4 people connected by something far stronger than their differences. Their shared humanity, their care for one another, and the simple truth that sometimes the most beautiful beginnings come from unexpected places. The weekend of their camping trip arrived with perfect autumn weather, crisp, clear days and star-filled nights. As Anthony had predicted, Elizabeth complained good-naturedly about sleeping on the ground, but the warmth of the campfire and the joy on Thomas's face as he roasted his first marshmallow made any discomfort worthwhile. On their final evening, As the boys slept soundly in their tent after an exhausting day of hiking and exploring, Anthony and Elizabeth sat side by side watching the dying embers of the campfire. The conversation between them flowed easily, moving from childhood memories to future hopes, from parenting challenges to professional aspirations. "I've been thinking about that moment in the grocery store," Elizabeth said softly, her face illuminated by the golden glow of the fire. "How differently things might have turned out if I hadn't approached you to apologize." Anthony considered this. "I think our paths would have crossed eventually. The hospital isn't that big." "Maybe," Elizabeth agreed. "But would we have seen each other clearly? Or would we have just been colleagues passing in the hallway, never knowing what we might mean to each other?" Anthony took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers naturally, as if they'd been doing this for years rather than minutes. Some connections are meant to happen regardless of the path. As a shooting star streaked across the sky above them, Elizabeth leaned her head against Anthony's shoulder. Neither felt the need to make wishes on falling stars anymore. Everything they needed was right here. Two boys dreaming peacefully in their tent, and two adults who had found in each other not just romantic possibility, but a deeper understanding of what it means to truly see another person. The campfire dwindled to glowing coals, but the warmth between them continued to grow. Promising a future neither could have imagined that day in the grocery store when a white woman alerted a black single dad, and hours later, found herself begging him to save her son.